There's a sequence that plays out in a specific number of steps, almost every time. Once a relationship falls into this pattern, and once you can see the steps laid out, you'll recognize them instantly from your own life. He raises something real, it gets ignored. He raises it again, it gets deflected. He raises it a third time, his frustration finally showing in his voice, and that's the moment the entire conversation flips. Suddenly, the issue was never the issue. His tone is the issue. And 3 days later, he's the one apologizing. This is Robbin, and this is the honest ledger. Today, we're mapping that exact sequence step by step, what I'd call the label game, using 3 real, specific situations to show you precisely how it plays out, what it trains a man to do over time, and how to actually break the cycle instead of just surviving inside it. One thing needs to be said clearly, and I'll say it once. This is a mechanism, not a claim about an entire gender. It shows up in some relationships and not others, and naming the pattern clearly is what actually helps, not a theory about who's capable of what. Let's open the ledger and walk through exactly how this plays out. The first entry in the ledger is the sequence itself, because it has a predictable shape once you know what to look for. It starts with a real, specific behavior that's actually a problem: overspending, disrespect, a pattern that's hurting the relationship. He brings it up calmly using every tool a marriage counselor would recommend. No attacks, no character judgments, just a specific concern raised respectfully. That gets met with silence, a subject change, or a vague, "we'll talk later," that never actually happens. That's the first test, seeing whether he'll just let it drop. If the concern is real, he doesn't let it drop, so he raises it again, maybe reworded, maybe at a better time. This time it gets met with mild defensiveness. "Why are you making such a big deal about this?" Or some version of a deflection that still doesn't touch the actual issue. He tries once more, and by now there's real frustration in his voice because he's been dismissed twice on something that actually matters. And that's the exact moment the entire conversation flips. The problem stops being whatever he originally raised. The problem becomes his tone, his raised voice, the fact that he's being mean or attacking. On the ledger, a legitimate concern raised 3 separate times through 3 separate respectful attempts, replaced entirely by a referendum on the one moment his patience finally cracked. The second entry is the first case, and it's about money. Picture a man whose wife spent $3,000 on a trip they'd specifically agreed they couldn't afford. He raises it calmly. "We agreed on a budget. What happened here?" The response isn't an explanation. It's, "I never get to do anything for myself. You're always trying to control me." He tries again, still measured. "This isn't about whether you deserve it. It's that we can't afford an extra $3,000 right now." She starts crying. "Why do you always make me feel guilty? You're so mean to me." The conversation ends with him comforting her. The $3,000 is never discussed again. What this costs him isn't just the money, it's the precedent. The following month, it's $2,000 more on something else, and the same cycle runs again, until eventually he stops checking the shared statements entirely, because absorbing the financial damage silently costs him less than living through the conversation required to address it. On the ledger, a real, specific, agreed-upon boundary, dissolved completely, replaced by his own guilt for having brought it up. Notice what actually happened in that exchange. He didn't lose the argument on the merits. There was no merits discussion at all. He lost it entirely on the shift from budget to guilt, a shift that took less than a minute and required zero engagement with the actual number on the statement. The third entry is the second case, and it's about respect in front of other people. Picture a man whose wife regularly interrupts him, contradicts him, and makes jokes at his expense in front of her family, undermining his standing with the kids in the process. He raises it privately and specifically. "When that happens in front of your family, it makes me feel disrespected and undermines me with the kids." The response reframes the entire concern instantly. "You're too sensitive. They don't mean anything by it. Why are you trying to come between me and my family? You're being controlling." He raises it again over months, several more times, and each attempt gets the same reframe. His legitimate concern about being undermined recast as him being insecure or difficult. Eventually, he stops going to family events altogether, not because he doesn't want a relationship with her family, but because attending them stopped being worth what it cost him. What this produces, predictably, is a complaint from her that he doesn't want to spend time with her family, with zero connection drawn to the years of dismissed requests that made those events genuinely intolerable for him. On the ledger, a specific, repeated request for basic respect converted into a character flaw of his, while the actual behavior that prompted the request never changes even once. What makes this case especially frustrating is how small the actual ask was. Not that she cut off contact with her family, just that she stopped undermining him in front of them. A request that modest, refused that consistently, tells you something about the actual priority being protected, and it isn't the family relationship being claimed as the reason. The fourth entry is the third case, and it's the one a lot of men will recognize most painfully. A dead bedroom, intimacy down to once a month or less, with a man who's tried everything reasonable to address it. He communicates clearly, asks what would help, tries more romance, tries helping more around the house, tries backing off entirely to remove pressure. Nothing changes. When he finally says plainly, "This is seriously damaging our marriage and we need to address it," the response reframes the entire need instantly. Is that all you ever think about? You're so shallow. There's more to marriage than sex. I'm stressed. Stop pressuring me. His actual, legitimate need for physical connection with his own wife gets recast as shallowness, as pressure, as something wrong with him for wanting it, while the actual withdrawal of intimacy from the relationship is never named as the problem it actually is. Eventually, he stops asking. What follows, predictably, is a complaint that he never initiates anymore, with no acknowledgement that years of rejection and criticism are exactly what trained him to stop. This is arguably the cruelest version of the pattern, because the thing being withheld and the thing being used to dismiss his concern about it are the same thing. Intimacy itself becomes both the wound and the weapon used to deny the wound exists. The fifth entry is the thread that connects all three of these cases, because the specific topic never actually matters. Money, respect, or intimacy, the mechanism runs identically every time. A real, specific, legitimate concern gets raised. It gets deflected instead of addressed. It gets raised again and deflected again. Frustration eventually shows, however mildly, and the entire conversation pivots onto that frustration as the real problem, while the original issue disappears completely under the weight of managing his reaction to being dismissed. On the ledger, whatever the actual subject was, it's the reaction to being ignored that ends up on trial, every single time, which means the underlying behavior never has to change because it's never actually the thing being discussed. The sixth entry is what this teaches a man across dozens of repetitions of this exact sequence, because the lesson is consistent regardless of which topic triggered it. He learns that addressing a problem doesn't lead to the problem being addressed. It leads to a multi-day argument about his delivery, ending in an apology he didn't actually owe. And the completely rational response to that lesson, learned across enough repetitions, is to simply stop raising things. Not because he stopped caring about the overspending, the disrespect, or the intimacy, because the cost of raising any of it consistently exceeds whatever benefit came from raising it. Picture the same man across all three of these situations. Several years later, he doesn't check the statements, he skips the family gatherings, he stopped initiating intimacy long ago. From the outside, that looks like disengagement. From the inside, it's the fully rational output of a very consistent pattern of evidence. Call it whatever you want, checked out, distant, withdrawn, but it's worth being precise about what it actually is. A decision made rationally and repeatedly that raising things costs more than it returns. That's not the same thing as stopping caring, even though from the outside it can look identical. The seventh entry is the irony that closes the loop, and it's the part that should genuinely infuriate any man who's lived through this. The exact withdrawal this pattern produces becomes the next thing he gets blamed for. He's checked out. He's distant. He never talks anymore. He doesn't initiate. He doesn't want to spend time with her family. Every one of those complaints is the direct, traceable output of years spent being punished for engaging honestly, and none of that traceability gets acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require connecting her own responses to his current behavior, the exact accountability the entire pattern was built to avoid in the first place. On the ledger, a man blamed for the specific outcome that the pattern itself manufactured, with the actual cause conveniently left out of the story being told about him. The eighth entry is what you're actually entitled to here, stated plainly. You deserve a partner who can hear a specific respectfully raised concern and engage with the substance of it, not redirect it, not wait you out, not convert your frustration into the real subject of the conversation. That's not a high bar. It's the minimum requirement for a relationship where real problems can actually get solved instead of quietly compounding for years. If overspending, disrespect, or a lack of intimacy is a real issue, it deserves an honest answer, even an uncomfortable one, not a referendum on how patiently you delivered your fifth attempt to raise it. The ninth entry is how you actually interrupt this sequence instead of just living inside it. The leverage point is earlier than most men think. It's the second or third attempt before frustration has crept into your voice and given the conversation something else to redirect onto. State the issue plainly, ask for a specific, concrete response rather than a vague, "we'll talk later." And if you're met with deflection again, name that directly and calmly. "I've raised this twice now and it hasn't actually been addressed. I need an actual answer, not a redirect." If a raised voice does happen because you've been dismissed multiple times, don't let an apology for that tone become the entire resolution. Acknowledge the tone if it's warranted, and then explicitly bring the conversation back to the original issue in the same breath. "I'm sorry I raised my voice, and I still need us to actually talk about the budget." Refuse to let the apology substitute for the conversation. Add it all up, and here's the full ledger. What the label game costs a man who lives inside it, across money, respect, and intimacy alike, a real concern replaced by a referendum on his tone, 3 respectful attempts that all end the same way, a rational retreat from raising anything at all, and eventually getting blamed for the exact distance the pattern itself manufactured. What breaking the sequence requires: catching the deflection early, demanding a specific answer instead of a vague deferral, and refusing to let an apology for tone stand in for the conversation that was actually owed. Now here's what you actually do with this. First, catch the deflection at the first or second attempt, not the third. The moment you notice a real concern getting met with silence, a subject change, or a vague, later, name that directly instead of letting it slide and trying again quietly. Waiting until the third attempt is exactly when frustration tends to show, which is exactly when the conversation becomes vulnerable to the flip. Second, ask for something specific and concrete every time, not a general acknowledgement. What are we actually going to do differently gets you further than, "Can we talk about this?" Because vague conversations produce vague, forgettable outcomes that are easy to quietly abandon once the discomfort of the moment has passed. Third, separate the apology from the resolution when a redirect does happen. It's fine to own a raised voice if it happened. It is not fine to let owning that be the entire outcome while the original issue goes unaddressed in the same breath. Say both things in the same conversation out loud so neither one gets to stand alone. Fourth, keep a real, honest account for yourself of which concerns actually got resolved versus which ones quietly disappeared into an argument about something else. Patterns are easy to deny in the moment and very hard to deny once they're written down plainly. Fifth, bring in outside help. A counselor, a trusted third party, if this sequence is running consistently across multiple topics over multiple years. A pattern this deeply grooved usually needs more structure to interrupt than willpower alone can provide. And sixth, know your own threshold. If the sequence keeps repeating despite repeated, calm, specific attempts to interrupt it, that's real information about whether the relationship is capable of the accountability it needs. And you're allowed to weigh that information seriously, not just absorb another cycle of it indefinitely. None of this is about winning an argument for the sake of winning it. It's about refusing to accept a relationship where real issues never actually get addressed because addressing them always somehow becomes about you instead. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments. Which version of this have you lived through? The money version, the respect version, the intimacy version, or some version of your own? And how far did it go before something changed? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this finally mapped out a pattern you've been living without being able to name it, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up one entry at a time.